All right, so we have a couple folks trying to come on. I think Chuck is popping on and off. So we'll give Chuck another minute or two. And then Brian said he won't be able to join us today. So we'll give it till 10:35. And then in the meantime, if you all want to pull up the two documents we'll be working on today, they're both on the webpage. There's a version 6 of our master working document that we've been working through. That's the longer of the two documents. And then there is the key findings and key recommendations document we're titling A1 section work group report. Those are both in our on our webpage for this subcommittee. Any questions? Yeah.
I assume you're going to pull them up as we're talking through them. I'm not going to pull them up separately. I don't have two screens to look at, so I have one little box here. So I'll just wait till you pull them up.
All right, sounds good, Mark. We did receive two groups of comments and edits that came into those documents. So or two individuals from our group added comments and edits. So I incorporated those into the larger version 6 of the document to the best of my abilities. But as always, if you find anything that's missing, just let me know. I'll make sure that it's in there. And as a note, I know some of you don't use Microsoft Word. So if you're using a different word processor and you're running into any issues with like providing comment bubbles or anything, it can sometimes be helpful, instead of replying to somebody's comment, just highlighting a different word and commenting separately. That could be a helpful way for me to just add that in there. Sometimes it's hard for me to kind of carry over the detailed kind of comment bubble conversations, but like I said, I'll do my best to capture everything in these documents, and let me know if there's anything missing. All right, so it's 10:35. Any comments or questions before we get started? Excellent. Okay, so I'm gonna pull up the agenda here. There's another relatively straightforward meeting planned for today. We're going to be going through both documents, trying to get as close as we can to sort of a good place so that the work group has something to review for their meeting this week. And then the comments and edits for both of these documents can continue to come in as more drafts of this larger work group report are worked on. So this isn't our last opportunity, but a very good opportunity to make some progress here. Okay, I don't see Sam on. Oh, he is joining now. Hey, Sam, thanks for joining. We're just getting to the part where I usually check in with you to see if there's any items that you wanted us to address beyond our kind of typical agenda items, any process pieces or anything.
No, I'm good to go. Thank you for asking.
All right, thanks, Sam. So let's go ahead and dive in here. First, I'll kind of orient us to the two different documents, because we kind of have to keep them both in mind as we're working through this. And then we'll dive into the first kind of master document. We'll highlight some areas of major changes that have come in over the last week, so that way we can kind of acquaint ourselves with those. We'll draw attention to anywhere that the group feels like we really need to work on. And then we'll go over to our key findings, key recommendations document and try to get that a little bit more squared away, because that's going to be the piece that's embedded within the main work group document. So that's the piece that they'll be focusing most on and drawing their attention to. So first, let me pull up the major document. Okay. So we should be looking at a document that says Benton County Solid Waste Process Work Group at the top. All right, seeing nods. So this is the master working document. It's the longer of the two documents. This document is one that is proposed to be at the end of the kind of work group total document. And it will be, I think, an appendix on that document, if that's correct, Sam. Okay, so this is what we've been focusing most of our attention on. Just briefly before we start editing this, I'm going to display the second document, just so I want us all to be on the same page here. The second document is this section A, landfill size, capacity, longevity. Do we see that on the screen? Okay. So yeah, this document essentially highlights key findings and key recommendations that the subcommittee is proposing to the work group. This will be embedded in the main section, the body of the work group report, and this is probably something that the work group generally will be focused more on than the larger document that will be in the appendix. Both will this document will reference the larger document in the appendix. So we want to make sure they're consistent, and essentially the goal here is to try to draw the key findings and key recommendations from the larger document into the shorter document, sort of summarizing those for the work group. Any questions about the differences, how to kind of go about focusing on both of these? Yeah, Paul.
I did have one kind of procedural process question here, Daniel. In the past, when I've worked on a giant document that has key pieces that have to get distilled into like a spec or a summary of key findings or whatever, we've taken some pains to embed those links essentially in the document, so that those are automatically summarized and automatically updated. Is the intent here to have a totally separate document that we have to track any changes we make in the main one to the key findings just by hand? Because that's how it's looking, right?
Yeah, thanks, Paul. So so far, yes, and that was mainly born out of not having those kind of key findings and key recommendations highlighted in the main document. So it's sort of out of the necessity of that. I think ideally the main document will be as you recommended, where the key findings, key recommendations are tagged in the larger document, and then we can create a table of contents of those as you did in your proposed edits. I think that's a great way to go about it, and probably the best way to go about it, but I wanted to make sure we had some content to propose, even if we don't get to that part of it. I think ideally though, that's an excellent suggestion and the way I would propose moving forward.
Okay, thanks, Daniel.
All right, any other questions? Okay, I'm going to stop sharing one more time and go back to the what we're calling the master working document. Okay, so the first area that I wanted to draw our attention to is just what Paul was talking about, this table of findings. Paul has kindly started to essentially tag key findings that he had pointed out in the document. And we are going to code those by heading, so that way we could have a table of findings. I think the idea is also to have that with recommendations. And I think that's an excellent way to organize, so that way we could at some point essentially copy and paste that content into our key findings, key recommendations document. Any thoughts on that? I haven't started to do that work of tagging the remaining items, but Paul got a good start on his. Yeah, Mark.
Yeah, thanks, Daniel. No comments on the format, but we're not looking at these right now. In other words, they're too small for me to read them.
Oh,
but,
shoot. Okay.
Yeah, we're not, or are we looking at them as they are?
No, the point of this isn't to kind of assess the findings so much as
Okay.
the format. I'm
Okay.
hoping to go into the findings in just a little bit.
Great. Perfect. Thank you. That helps. It's
All
much
right.
more readable now.
Thanks, Mark. Yeah, and so we have an awfully wide document with the body of the document, the kind of edits, the edit pane, and then the comments. So try to help me guide where we want to focus, and I'll try to scroll over to the comments and things like that. Excellent. So we have this table of findings. I'll keep working on my end to try to essentially tag those in the document as best I can. So hopefully the next version will have a more complete table of findings, table of recommendations that match what our other document is showing. And that'll make work a lot easier. Forgive me while I kind of scroll down here. I'm going to try my best to get to other major changes that have happened in the interim. Generally, I think Paul suggested removing a fair amount of the comments that were essentially placeholders for content. These red kind of italics comment areas calling out what we might need. Some of those I left in with a strike through, mainly because they had comment bubbles associated with them. So I put in the strike through for our discussion here, but anything with a comment bubble I made sure to leave in, so that way we can capture those comments. So we had this history section, not a lot of updates here, but I know we got a couple of comments in between meetings. Anybody want to draw our attention here specifically? Yeah, Paul.
I'll acknowledge Mark's suggestion that this history ought to be more comprehensive, specifically in terms of going back and looking at how the landfill got started, more of an accidental type of genesis rather than a planned, well-researched start to the landfill. So Mark, I'll see if I can come up with some bullets there, and you and I can iterate on that and then we can send it out to the group for comments, primarily from our public services, I guess.
Yeah, that's great, Paul. I think it is important for the community to understand that this landfill just didn't begin in 1974. I understand that, that was maybe the first formal action by Benton County. Yeah, I think it's important for context to go back. I don't know how much detail we need to put in there, but something to provide some context.
Yeah, I agree, and I apologize, Mark. When I originally wrote this skeleton out, I envisioned sort of a whole influx of comments and data later on, and that largely has not happened. So, this was pretty skeletal, and I'll see if I can flesh this out a little bit.
Yeah, so, no worries.
I have a quick suggestion. Our E1 subcommittee has done a ton of work on this, and they've they had the same suggestions and kind of concerns about how to incorporate the history, what's important here. And I think that maybe referencing their work as opposed to trying to recreate their work here, or kind of try to do it over again. I think that might be a good way to go about it. So essentially having the reader reference their more complete document, especially because I think they've sort of summarized history that will be very relevant to the reader for this document, even if that's copying pasting, which I'm not sure is needed. Yeah, Sam.
So that's the point I was going to make. So literally, as we are talking on this call, Marge and Mark and Ginger are, drafts going back and forth and edits that speak to that and actually use the term, quote, accidental, unquote. And that is all being hashed out. And so for this draft, I am suggesting that, you can put a couple of lines here and then, cross-reference to section E, which will have a bunch of details. I don't think doing a separate one in full meal deal, 5-page separate one here and there makes any sense at all. Just get enough to know that it's a placeholder and then to look to the other document. I think that's all we're going to be able to accomplish, because remember, I got to get all this out by midnight tonight to people.
Thanks, Sam. And Mark.
Yeah, so thanks, Sam. I think that's fine. Just I wasn't looking for a super long detailed. I understand that subgroup E is doing their work, so maybe a bulletized, just a couple bullets here, just to, go back to 1941 or 42 or whenever it was that it started. But a few bullets is all I'm looking for, and then a reference. That's great. That works for me.
Thanks, Mark. All right. So I'll do my best to update this for this next draft going over to Sam. But let's continue to think about this. I know, Paul, you said you'd be thinking about it too. So just send me whatever you have. And in this next version, I'll do my best to make sure it's kind of cleaned up here. Yeah,
Daniel,
Sam.
I'm sorry. And on this point, let's see what the people on the call think. Just stop right there. So I am literally thinking about this out loud, because I've got these 5 reports coming in, and they're in different states of evolution. The clearest example here is back up, but don't go there scrolling, but back at the top, you have a track changed version of a table of contents. I am wondering for this draft, if this group is comfortable enough with quote unquote accepting that, so the physical piece of paper looks cleaner, recognizing, and that really we're only track changing at this point, and using comments for things that are substantive hanging chads or issues in dispute. But if we can clean up, I'm trying to say inarticulately, if we can clean this up and get rid of the formatting, true formatting changes, like I see you changed the font, to a different color. Well, they don't need to know that it was, Calibri, and now it's something else. I mean, right? They don't need to know that we changed the font style. Is that going to be acceptable for people? We'll keep a native draft so you can, not lose anything. But to the extent we can clean this off, like this thing, Dan, do you have historical data on this? What I'm saying is, right now, the work group doesn't need to see that. You can have your own copy of this document that's dirty to keep track of, but to the extent we can clean this up a little, I think that would help them. Reactions, thoughts, counter suggestions?
I'm fine with that. I would leave it up to, I actually have never even looked at the table of contents. I'm fine with that. I would like to defer to somebody like Paul, who actually has more ownership in this, to make sure he's okay. But I agree that the work group doesn't need to see, that's why Daniel's got it struck out here. But accepting that change, for example, I don't have any problem with that.
Yeah, Paul.
Yeah, I agree. We could certainly clean this up, I think, considerably, just for readability and review by the work group. And as long as we still had a record of kind of the hanging changes, a record of the changes, should we need to go back and reference it, which I suspect largely for the formatting changes, we will not.
All right. Thanks, Paul. Any other thoughts? Okay. Yeah, I largely agree. And this is work I'm happy to do. I can have our kind of extra comment heavy version for us to continue working from, so that we're not losing any of these. And then for today's response to Sam, I'll be sending a simplified version with the things that are relatively undisputed left out comment wise, and then the things that are kind of major disputes or things that we really need to be focusing on, I'll do my best to leave those in and kind of use my judgment there if that's all right with folks. Yeah, Paul.
So Daniel, just to be clear, you're going to do what in the software world we'd call a branch. You're going to peel off from version 6 and generate a cleaned up version. That's going to the work group, and then we continue to march forward with the dirty versions, as Sam would say, right?
Yeah, that would be my intent.
Okay.
Yeah, Sam's giving a thumbs up. Okay, does that sound good to everyone? All right, awesome. Great. So I got rid of that kind of extra edit pane, so we should be able to see the comments a little bit more cleanly. And thanks for that suggestion, Sam. I think that'll be helpful just for today's review as well. So my ask generally is that folks kind of go through the comments. Some of the comments I haven't, if the comment was to add something to the text or change something about the text, for the new ones, I haven't been able to do that. So essentially, if there's substantive changes proposed in the comments that weren't also changed in the text, I'll be making those as soon as I can, but those haven't all been incorporated into the text since this last week. So I'll be going through all of those, making sure that any suggested changes are actually reflected in the text as best as I can. When it conflicts with another proposed change, let's say somebody proposed two different versions of the same wording or same content, I'm doing my best to capture both of those, highlighting where they conflict and kind of merging where they don't conflict. Just quick note on my approach to all this. Okay, yeah, Paul.
It looks like Republic Services through Ginger have not yet provided their feedback on the version 5 markups, correct?
Correct.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, so we have a fair amount of changes on this images section. It was added by Paul. Essentially, we have different views of the landfill. Paul, if you want to speak to this at all, the question to the group is, how do we feel about these? Is this something that we want to keep? Does it add the value, or does it add to our findings and recommendations? But Paul, go for it if you have any comments on these.
Yeah, my intent here, of course, was just to give the reader a little perspective on how this landfill has morphed over the decades. And some of these images were available from community members. A lot of them, the provenance is kind of uncertain, like this one, the long line of the vehicles at the dump. Supposedly that's circa 1970 something. But I think they're useful to the reader in terms of providing an overview of what this landfill looked like. This is an interesting shot here. I'm curious as to what Republic might have to say about including this, because this was their image. And it's a little hard to tell that it's a landfill in this image. It's quite beautiful back in 2008. And then, of course, there's a newer.
I might have missed the fall 2022 one somehow, but I'll add it in there if it's in there, and if not, I'll get it from you, Paul. Excellent. Okay, so any thoughts on these? Any responses? I've added them to the text, but wanted to pose it to the group. Yeah, Mark.
I was just going to say, yeah, I think it's helpful. I appreciate Paul's efforts to pull these in, and I think again, providing some context is part of what I think we should be doing is in this process. So yeah, great, thanks.
Thanks, Mark. One comment I had is I think some of these images, if the point is to show how the landfill has changed, I'm not convinced that these images do that, mainly because like the sort of side-by-side comparison opportunity really isn't there. So if we have any ideas on how to reformat them or how to kind of compare apples to apples, I think that'd be helpful. I think obviously there's like a narrative component, like the long line of vehicles at the landfill. You don't know what location that is. You don't know a lot about it. I think that can be standalone. But if there is like, if you want to show that the size of the landfill changed with a visual image, I think having a side-by-side comparison could be really helpful. Yeah, Mark. You're muted.
Yeah, sorry. I was just going to say, so I'm not particularly skilled at this, but I know there are others who Google Earth has historic aerial photos, And how far back they go for this particular site, I don't know. And I'm not a power Google Earth user, but I have seen, where I've worked, I've seen people use Google Earth or some Google Earth product to be able to say, oh yeah, this is what this looked like in 1977. And so maybe that, because usually that is from the same format, or you can cut out from the same format and look at it from a top view, but just a thought.
Yeah, good suggestions, Mark. Any other thoughts on this section? Yeah. Ian?
No, I would tend to agree. Something like the Google Earth is probably more useful because it's the same perspective on all of the photos.
Okay. Thank you, Ian. Yeah, I can. I'm not gonna be diving into Google Earth on this, just for sake of time. But if anybody has any, time to dive into that, or try their best to sort of, even if you're taking the images here that we do have, putting them side by side somehow, kind of giving a similar perspective. I think that my point is that I think that could go a long way to demonstrating the point of this. If we want a visual key finding here, I think we should do a better job of highlighting that, where right now it's hard to tell. We're comparing apples to oranges generally, I think. Sam.
This is going to be my theme for today and all the subcommittees, and it was last night, is we are in triage mode for the next 12 hours here. And so I'm suggesting the way to address this is keep them in there now, drop a note that says, next draft will look into Google Earth from the same perspective. Done. Don't spend time going on Google Earth today and doing this. We just don't have the bandwidth. We can pick that up in the following week for the draft that goes to SWAC DSAC Planning Commission. But for between now and midnight, we don't have the time. So just note it and let's move on.
Thanks, Sam. Mark.
Sounds good to me. I was just going to suggest, Daniel, you might ask your GIS folks, because those are the people who know how to use that stuff.
Thanks, Mark. All right, so let's go ahead and scroll down. And I think to Sam's point, I think while my goal is to highlight some major changes that I've added, I think also focusing on the really substantive pieces are going to be an important strategy for today. So I'll kind of scroll down to where we've seen some of the most changes. If anybody catches anything or wants me to draw my attention somewhere visually on the screen for us to discuss, just let me know as I scroll down here. One comment did come in about we have an appendicized chart with different properties. The corresponding maps are here. The question was essentially, where is the map to compare it to this chart? So they're here and here, these property maps. Okay. The other property map piece is the purchase dates are going to be, they're still being worked on, to Ian and Paul's points about some properties not being purchased, not showing the correct purchase date prior to 1983. Essentially, we're just working on that. We just don't have records yet, but we're still digging for other records that show when those purchase dates come in. Okay. So this benchmark piece is an important addition. Paul added some text here to kind of kick us off in a narrative way. And then we're still kind of figuring out how do we have this like benchmark, the idea of total capacity started this conversation off. We've also had the ideas of potentially using kind of proposed closure dates over time as they were demonstrated in historical documents, which might be a good option. So far, I think Paul has added this 1983 number, a 2003 number. I know Mark also added some total capacity that was drawn from the 1983 CUP process, I believe. So I think we're adding some key bullet points here. I think we should probably be leaving out question mark sort of dates. My concerns here remain that if we're getting these from site development plans that only talk about the area that's to be developed and aren't including additional space within this total capacity, we're not telling the story that you're hoping to tell. If you're hoping to compare total capacity to total capacity over time, and you're using data from site development plans and their tables, you're not doing that, right? Site development plans are talking about remaining area to be developed, and that's what the capacity in those charts are telling us. So that's my main concern. That was the concern with this 2003 number as well, from earlier. But I'm open to thoughts. Generally, I think this probably falls into the category of future work for us, and probably a larger piece of contention is how to explain the kind of changes over time that we're talking about, whether it's with total capacity if we have the data, or whether we're using another benchmark like expected closure dates over time. I see Ian, your mic is off. Go for it.
Well, no, I was just going to add, a lot of times you're right, Daniel. Those are talking about to be developed capacity, not total site capacity going back to the beginning of the site. Whereas these later numbers are total going back to the beginning of the site. So it's really not always the apples to apples comparison. So that's where it gets a little challenging, because some of those older site development plans don't really list what was already developed at that point. They're just listing future.
Yeah. Okay, thanks, Ian. And to that note, I do, our staff is working on trying to find historic benchmarks for total capacity in older documents, as well as other potential benchmarks, like I think Ken Eklund suggested maybe using those reported potential closure dates, or the expected closure dates as they're reported over time. So we're just tracking those benchmarks, and the goal is to bring them back to the group and say, do these benchmarks kind of work for us to tell this story? Yeah, Mark.
Just wondering whether or not there's any value in consulting DEQ permit documents. I haven't looked closely at those. And so I don't know, because I think this is the way we've titled this section is permitted capacity. And so when I was thinking about this, I was thinking about it in terms of DEQ approval of area to accept waste.
Thanks, Mark. I think there's an issue with how far those documents go back, though. I think the structure of DEQ approval has changed a fair amount. So we get into this 20-year kind of area, but I think that's a really good point. I haven't pulled older permit documents from DEQ to verify what the total capacity and how that's discussed. So I think that's a really good opportunity.
Yeah, and I think when Brian Fuller was at the table, he said he thought they had those documents. Some were electronic and some were in paper files. And so he said if things were needed. So I don't know if, I can't remember what the new person's name is, but if she might be able to get them from paper files.
Good suggestion, Mark. Thank you.
So I will just add, I don't know about really old permit documents, but more modern ones don't directly reference the capacity in the permit. They reference the DEQ approved site development plan, which is where that those numbers would be, because DEQ itself doesn't directly list that in the permit. They have the site and the site engineers develop that document that then the DEQ has to approve or disapprove to list the capacity. So I don't have any of the old site development plans, so maybe DEQ does have them on file somewhere.
Okay. Yeah, and we're doing our digging too to try to get some of the older site development plans as well, just to look for permitted capacity numbers. So I'll do my best to update the group. Yeah, Paul.
Let me give a specific example of a data point that I think would be really useful here if we could find it. And that is cell 6. So back in 2003, it seems that effectively cell 6 was approved as part of the whole 2003 approval of the, I think it was the East Triangle in 03. But it's not clear to me that was the official approval date by Benton County for cell 6. And it's not clear what they were approving unless it was that site development plan. My understanding of the process is the Planning Commission has to approve the site development plan because the one concern I have is the cell 6 that was envisioned back in 03, I think is very different than the cell 6 that's proposed in the 2021 site development plan, which as far as I know has not yet been formally approved by Benton County. So Daniel, if you and your staff can kind of clear that up for cell 6, I think that would help us a lot in terms of figuring out the best way to accurately and consistently document sizes that are permitted.
Thanks, Paul. Yeah, I can do my best. I don't know how Benton County's approval would have to do with the development of cell 6 specifically. I think that's more on DEQ. They essentially have the construction plan for that. So I don't know that Benton County actually specifically approves specific cell development. But I'll double check and see what our planning folks have on that. I see Ian, your mic is on. Yeah, go for it.
I would just add a little color from my knowledge of it. Cell 6 was approved during the 1983 landfill site zoning because that area was part of that landfill site zoning back in 1983. So it's been approved in that form from nearly the beginning. The piece in 2003 was just a very small triangle adjacent to the landfill site zoning that they did to optimize the footprint of that. But as far as the actual quarrying, as far as I know, that's an outright allowed use in the landfill site zoning. So this was just to allow them to quarry and then landfill in a small corner.
Thanks, Ian. I think we just
as far as the actual design, it goes back at least to 2000. I don't have documents from prior to that though, but the actual layout has been around for quite some time.
Okay, and I'm anticipating a fair amount of discussion on this that we probably don't have time for today. So if we have any quick items to flag for our future discussion, or if we want to take it offline and include in additional edit. Yeah, Mark.
Yeah, Daniel, I was just going to say that, so I'm on the land use subcommittee, and I can tell you that in the 1994 application to expand the landfill, cell 7 and 8 were actually where cell 6 is now. So there's going to be some confusion there. So yeah, I think we need to take it offline, but the 9410 or 9411 application has a map that shows cell 7 and 8 where cell 6 is, and cell 6 was across the road.
Yeah, okay, yeah, so for not approved applications, maps floating around can be confusing on cell names and all that. Okay, well, let's take it offline and come back to it, but I'm going to flag this, and if anybody wants to add comments to this or edits, feel free, send them over to me and I'll incorporate it into the document. Thanks for calling that out, Paul. Okay, so let's go ahead and move on. I think we're doing okay generally on this reported airspace. We don't see a lot of material. Paul added some context here, but I think we're generally squared away on that. Okay, so one of the big items that have been in discussion is this intake volume. I'm going to request that we stop calling it volume if possible, because we're talking about tonnage, and as we know, tonnage and volume have very specific differences for landfills. So if we can change how we're discussing it, I think it could be less confusing for a reader. But we have essentially this idea of intake limits that are discussed in the 2000 franchise and the 2020 franchise. This is, I would say, one of the key kind of points of kind of disagreement so far. in the latest renditions of this document, essentially how these two lines, the blue line and the red line, are described. Chuck, I see your hand. I'll come to you in just a sec. We have essentially, before they were both called franchise agreement limits, which I pointed out is misleading to the reader, where one is actually a limit on solid waste intake and one is a threshold to update a study from the county. So my suggestion and request was to update that language to make it very clear what we're talking about. I think I've received a fair amount of pushback on adding detail to that for some reason. I'm not sure what where we're at, but essentially we've added this section. I think Paul has added this 2000 and 2020 intake limit description. I would like to add some content here to essentially describe this in more detail that's sort of clear for the reader, but essentially making it clear that those are not similar or the same concepts. But I wanted to kind of do that overview briefly and see where we're at. And Chuck, go for it.
Okay, can you hear me, Daniel?
Yep, crystal clear.
Okay, up above where you said intake volume, volume means yardage, but when they first come in, they go over the scale. So that should be in ton. If you want to say scale intake or something like that to soften it, you know, where it's a tonnage going over the scale instead of intake volume. Intake volume would be kind of computed there where they have the scale tickets that verify everything coming over it. So you can say scale weight.
Thanks. Excellent. I've added that here. Okay. Any other thoughts on this? I think we have a fair amount of content here. Yeah, Mark.
Yeah, so with regard to this intake limits and this whole section, I will commit to go back and reading this more closely and trying to, I've been one of the ones who've been sort of pushing back, and I know there's a balance between calling it a limit and calling it a threshold or a trigger volume or something. But I will offline, I'll look at this a little bit more closely and try to give you and Paul some additional feedback.
Thanks, Mark. Yeah, and I have a fair amount of the kind of back and forth. I've been trying to capture that in the text and in comments. So I guess my request for this section is that we take a look. This might be a later draft version of the report, but just something that I think we should pay attention to is how we're talking about this and how we're drawing our findings from information, and just thinking about how the reader is going to see information and sort of prioritizing the clarity, I guess, is my request. Okay, anything else here? But generally, this is a section that was newly added, so I wanted to highlight this. Okay, so that kind of brings us to this chart. I added my suggested verbiage here, but that's kind of up for debate. I just wanted to capture that for the group. And then I've started kind of a reframing of this section, which we cross out, which describes that 2000 limit, 2020 limit. I left it in there so we can discuss it, but put a strike through. I'm putting in a proposed version of that, but let's include that in the conversation. I think largely that chunk could probably get wrapped up in the above section that Paul added in there. Chuck, I think I saw your hand.
Thanks. If you could go back up to that first graph, if you would be so kind.
Is it this one?
Yeah, limit on solid waste, tons disposed. Okay, I was just making sure the limit on the solid waste in the document is tons, not volume. That's what I had a concern. So we,
Thanks, Chuck. Yeah, I updated that intake tonnage on the left side. It was intake volume. I just added tonnage just so we can find a better word for it if we need to. I just wanted to make it clear to the reader that we weren't talking about volume, since that it can be a tricky part of figuring out longevity of the life of the landfill.
yeah, if you just put, if we can just, scale tonnage, because every time you go to the window, they give you a scale ticket. So I was just trying to orientate the reader with the actions going on out there.
Yeah, thanks, Chuck. Let's mark that down as essentially trying to find the language, and maybe that can get wrapped into that definition section at the top too, just so we can help kind of clarify what we're talking about. Okay, so we have this comments discussion section here. I think this is a really good section for us to draw findings from, especially because it's essentially interpreting the chart above. So I'm going to kind of flag that to start trying to draw findings. So if anybody wants to add kind of key findings, I think this chart generally is a really important set of information for the group. So let's try to go back to that and see if there's anything missing from there. But I think that could be a really good opportunity for us to start thinking about findings and recommendations. Okay. So we've had a few updates, a fair amount of comments within these kind of this discussion section of the chart. So please go in there, review those comments. I did my best to incorporate some of the changes in here, but just feel free to review, add your thoughts here. I think paying attention to this could add a fair amount of content to our kind of work group recommendation piece. Yeah, Mark.
Yeah, so thanks, Daniel. I commented somewhere in here, and I can't remember exactly where it is, but there was some discussion about the increased volume from 2016 to 2017 and pointing primarily to River Bend. And I think one of my comments, I don't know if it was here or earlier in the document, was there was no discussion about the increased business development by Republic Services to get additional people to bring garbage to the landfill. And so hopefully we can address that at some point in the process, because I'm not sure that we can say the increased volume was due to River Bend, which is what I think the language previously said. So yes, River Bend had an impact, but I also think that we've got to address the fact that Republic is aggressively seeking new sources of waste to bring to the landfill by their own acknowledgement.
Thanks, Mark. Yeah, just calling out that. Yeah, I don't think in this chart we're essentially acknowledging the role that the business side of the landfill plays. And I agree. I think attributing increases to kind of specifics like Riverbend closure is only going to be part of the story. Even if we're generally accepting that Riverbend probably impacted the landfill, I think trying to clarify that language is going to be helpful for the reader to just understand what's going on in the background. So thanks for that, Mark. I tagged it here, but if anybody wants to kind of take a stab at developing that, please do so we can incorporate that here. All right, any other thoughts as we move on? Okay. Let's see here. Generally, thank you, Paul, for adding nice little intro kind of verbiage. I think that was really helpful. Generally, just good introduction language for kind of each section. I think, okay, so yeah, and then Ken essentially talks about kind of another descriptor, essentially saying the chart above, we have a good kind of comment description discussion section. And I think Ken generally, the request is to have something similar here for this chart, and more specifically calling out the items that you're calling out with kind of describing Yamhill County's role, adding Yamhill County here, but maybe also just having a little bit more discussion, kind of like the chart above. I just wanted to make sure I'm capturing that right. I'm seeing a nod. Okay. Mark.
Yeah, I thought that I had added some comments, particularly about this chart. Maybe it's later on down here where I was asking about the huge jump in Benton County waste. From, if you go up just a little bit, yeah, Benton County goes from 179,000 in 2016 to 146,000. So I made a comment there, and then I also think I made a comment about the diversity of sources that could be included in the large increase in what's classified as other beginning in 2017. I know I put those comments on the document that I sent to you.
Yeah.
Okay, but anyhow, so I don't see any, they don't seem to be here, but maybe they're buried somewhere.
Thanks, Mark. Yeah, I definitely saw those comments. I'll double check and see where they landed. I think they might be up here. Yeah, I think they ended up here, but I'll make sure. I think those are good starts for essentially that discussion piece of that chart. If that makes sense, I can try to interpret some of those, add them as like a discussion item for interpreting that chart a bit.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, Ian.
Yeah, I will just say 2017, that's when the tanker turned over on Highway 99 near the landfill entrance. So I think that was close to 50,000 tons of material from that cleanup. So that's the big Benton County jump in 2017.
Thanks, Ian. Yeah, I think we wanted to draw on some of that info later on as well. So if you have any more details we can add, I think that was going to come up as an example for some of the scenarios we talked about. So if you have any other thoughts or kind of information we can include in this tanker cleanup, feel free to send them over. I think that'd be helpful. Chuck.
On that next graph down that you showed, is that tonnage or yards? It took me about a year to figure all this stuff out. So I just didn't want to add confusion to the reader. So it doesn't say intake by source. If we could just declare it's tonnage.
Oh, sorry, it scrolled up here. Yeah, I totally agree. I'll try to add a descriptor on the left side for that title. Thank you, Chuck. Okay, so let's go ahead and move on here. So we have in this landfill structure section, which is relatively new in the last couple versions, we have this cell detail that I think Paul added in here. And I think if I understand correctly, the request is to start including this date closed and start populating that. So we have essentially, we're calling out a bit of missing data here. But Paul, feel free to explain this and ask the group if we need anything else here.
Yeah, Ian, this is the chart that you had supplied back in November, I think it was. So thanks for pulling this together. I just included it because there was a comment a couple meetings back of it would be nice to have this in tabular format as well as sort of graphical format. So I just took your chart, Ian, and put it in here. But in doing so, I noticed that there really aren't closure dates for any of the cells. So if you could supply those, I think that would be helpful in terms of giving somebody an overall snapshot of what the state is.
Yeah, and that's why I wanted to discuss on this call, because there's a couple different ways this terminology is used that I think can be a little bit confusing. So that burn dump, closed landfill, that one's been relocated into into a line of cells, so it doesn't really have a closure date anymore because it's been moved. The other piece, other than cells 1 and 1A, we've done areas where we do the final cap, and maybe that's a better way to describe it, where you have the soil and geomembrane cover that goes over the top of the waste. We've done areas of that final cap, but no cell after cell 1 has ever been fully closed, because basically you have all these areas that are tied together at the base, And then once the site is completely done, that final cap will go over the top of it. We've done areas where we've put the cap on, but that's on areas that are kind of along Coffin View Road along the south side of the site. The grassy slopes you see on that side, if you drove by, those are all final cap. But it doesn't fully close that cell, because that cell, say cell 2A or 2B, is also tied into cell 3 and 4 and 5 in various areas. So there is no areas that are, none of those cells are fully closed, and really won't be until the very end when they're fully closed. So that's where there's the use of the word capped and closed can get a little confusing for non-landfill users, because we throw them around in the industry as meaning the same thing, but they don't really mean the exact same thing. So hopefully that made sense. I mean, so I could say that cells 1 and 1A were closed in the 1990s. I don't know the exact dates off the top of my head, but since then we've done areas of final cap, but no cells are fully closed.
Okay, yeah, so we'll go to Paul and then to Chuck.
So Ian, one suggestion would be if you or Ginger want to write some verbiage in here to basically document what you've said, then we could include that, and maybe that whole date closed column goes away if that's explained in the text or something. I just think we should, if we list all the cells and try to give the reader a picture of their status, opened and whatever kind of needs to be defined.
One suggestion I might have, if this works for Ian, is if we change the third column to say date capped or some such, and then put an explainer note, just defining the difference between capped and closed. Because I do understand what you're trying to get at, Paul. We're not saying that those are open cells where waste is currently going, right? And so I think it is really more of a terminology issue. Is that something that we could compromise on, Ian?
Yeah, I think we can come up with something. It's
all right, and Chuck. You're unmuted. Go for it.
Oh, thank you, Ian. On that closed burned up, I know that you moved everything out. Will that be, it's open now, but it hasn't been lined or anything. Will that be incorporated in another cell, or what's your strategy there? It's still good cell.
Yeah, it's part of cell 6. Naturally, we'll be quarrying that area now that the waste has been removed.
Yeah. Will it need to go down further, or is the floor design? I'm sorry.
No, it needs further excavation still.
Okay. Thank you.
All right, go for it, Sam. You're muted.
Sorry, I'm not trying to throw shade on the importance of this discussion. I'm simply suggesting you have about a half hour left in this meeting, and this kind of area is too granular in my mind for today. So yes, do it. Yes, drill down. Yes, figure out the magic words. And we got to get to more of the 10,000 foot level of this analysis so we can get a product out tonight by midnight. So if we can skip through to the, the real meal deal here to see if we can make any progress on, that's my strong recommendation.
Thanks, Sam. Okay, so with that, let's go ahead and try to get to some of this more high level items that need to be covered. I guess I'll pose it to the group. Is there anything that you wanted to focus on? I know the big one is the scenario discussion that I think I'm leaning towards going to next, but I wanted to ask the group. Yeah, Chuck.
I'm kind of jumping ahead just as a reminder. Ian put his time in there where cell 6 and everything will be consumed. And then I put down below there about the same information. It seems kind of redundant. Just use one or the other that I would suggest.
Thanks, Chuck. Yeah, I think Paul made the same comment, so I'll remove one of them. I think, Chuck, your version might actually be the better one to use just because it's in Word doc format instead of a photo.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. All right, any thoughts on where to draw our attention to? I think we probably need to have at least a brief scenario discussion. Yeah, Ken.
Yeah, I was just going to say exactly that.
Okay, so let's briefly discuss scenarios. I think generally there's more work that needs to happen on it, mainly to respond to Ken's content contributions, because we did not get many responses on those yet. And I think generally that's where we're at currently. Okay, so we largely have the same list up top. My goal was to try to start populating some information into each of these where we don't have information. And then I think the ask from last time was to go into some of the descriptive baseline scenarios that Ken put together as well as the human factors, and essentially make comments as to the main responding to the content of these as opposed to simply the style or the kind of overarching approach of the narrative versus the bullet point format. I think Ken's request was that we approach these and kind of provide adequate discussion for the points made. But Ken, if you want to add anything here, go for it.
Yeah, if we could just scroll back up to the bullet points. You know, we want to start this section kind of at that point. So I guess it's always been my idea that this section right here and these bullet points that we have, I mean, I did indeed develop a fair amount of expansion of these bullet points, which seems to have disappeared from the document altogether now. So my first question is, what happened to that?
Yeah, if there's anything that's not included here, I'll make sure to add it. I did not delete anything specifically from you for expansion of the bullet points. So just, yeah, if there's anything missing, just let me know. I'll make sure to include those.
Well, wait,
okay.
It's already there, isn't it? I mean, just scroll further down to the document. I thought all that stuff that follows is Ken's below this.
Well, that stuff that follows is mine, but I'm talking about other material that I developed. You know, we put together these bullet points. I mean, we just assembled those essentially as bullet points, but they're very not. They're not communicating very much. They don't communicate, for example, whether, you know, a particular bullet point is likely to increase the longevity of the landfill or decrease it. I mean, that would be it seems to me that would be a basic question that the work group would have, a basic organization of these bullet points. But what seems to have happened is there was part of the document, my revision document that I sent in, and this is actually some time ago, that just didn't make it through the formatting or whatever. So anyway, that was my first question, is what happened to that material? I will resubmit it in some manner to you, Daniel, to make sure that we get it. So that was the first point I wanted to cover. And you know, for viewers at home who haven't seen this, which I guess turns out to be everyone, you know, it's just taking these bullet points, it's grouping them together as things that are likely to increase the landfill longevity are grouped together, things that are likely to decrease longevity are grouped together, things that are mixed are noted, and kind of a little description, essentially just an expansion on what's happening here, where you call in historical references if those exist, or that they typically do, something like that. So anyway, that's what I'm talking about. And so those will appear, shortly after we hang up from this call, I guess. Now we can go down to the scenarios. Thank you.
Thanks, Ken. Yeah, and whatever content here that you're hoping to see is an accidental exclusion. So we want to make sure to capture that. So I'll do my research too for the previous versions. Okay. So I think generally, let's open it up to the floor. I think there is some room for kind of what we want to include in this group's charge as it relates to discussing scenarios, like how deep do we want to go into the various kind of descriptors. But I think also, there's a ton of content that can produce here. So I didn't get a lot of written comments on this, but if anybody has any comments that they've jotted down and want to include now, that would be a good time. Yeah, Chuck.
Just one question again. There's that A section draft. Now that will be in with the bigger document, I guess. And then is the intention of use that, then link it to this document? I just want to know strategy here, so don't have to be so redundant.
Yeah, so the strategy is essentially the sort of summarized key findings and key recommendations will be linked to this larger document. And the idea is that the user could click on the key finding or key recommendation, and they'd be taken to the fuller version that might include details or narrative sections that might be excluded from the kind of summary of key findings and key recommendations. But they would have a clickable link, and then this document would also be in the appendix of the larger work group draft.
Okay,
reference.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so any thoughts on this content essentially in any of the baseline scenario items, discussion items, or the human factor discussion items? Yeah, Ken.
So one of the inspirations for this was to anticipate the questions that work group and other readers of this document are going to have once we've kind of established this baseline. So if you think about it in terms of common questions, like for example, a very common question would be, well, what happens if Republic does not get, the fully excavated volume, for, which the baseline depends on. That would, to me, that seems like that would be a very common question that a reader would have. And of course, we can give an answer, or at least we can respond to that desire to know. And we can do it, by saying, well, there are various scenarios. This is how it actually would look. And so that's kind of, I think, the some thinking which I had. And so I'm just passing that along when we're actually thinking about these scenarios, thinking about questions that people have and how we can be, responsive to those questions.
Thanks, Ken. I had a sort of a general comment, and not so much a comment, a more kind of general approach comment. And that is essentially when I'm thinking about like readers' questions about some of these kind of scenarios that might impact landfill lifespan, the one place I keep going in my head is when you answer these questions in any way, almost across the board, when you're saying this is likely to increase landfill lifespan or decrease landfill lifespan or increase intake or decrease intake, I think that tends towards the misleading, mainly because I think the scenarios, like the possible opportunities or the possible different outcomes of any change or any of the scenarios we discuss are sort of limitless. So you're making choices on what to exclude, and I think for most of these, I can imagine a lot of different possibilities. And so that's my main point, is that I think there's a lot of different scenarios that we'd have to add, and this document could get very long if we make it sort of inclusive of the plausible outcomes. Yeah, Ken.
Well, I'm just pointing out that that's all of what you said is true of the baseline scenario. So it also, I mean, it you know, it is not based in reality. It essentially is kind of a mathematical equation. And as we know, reality is a little bit messier than just kind of doing the basic math. So, you know, I think that it would be very misrepresentational for this subcommittee to kind of put forward a single number or a single scenario. I mean, the baseline scenario as being the sort of thing that you can refer to. It's what one of the first questions would be, you know, has this ever happened before in the past? This sort of, you know, this sort of consumption of the volume that we've got, and it hasn't. And so going back to the main point, you know, I think that it's much more realistic to actually draw out some scenarios, a number of them, you know, which reflect the range of possibilities that exist. So, I mean, that's what I'm trying to do. And I'm trying, you know, and what I think the subcommittee should do is to just show there are scenarios, they aggregate around, you know, some questions can indeed be answered because they are indeed more math than speculation or, you know, human factors. But I think a number of outcomes being put forward is much more representational of what conversations we've had, or at least what the subcommittee is composed of, than any other alternative that I've seen so far.
Yeah, thanks, Ken. Sam and then Mark.
So I want to try to frame this up, recognizing this is a complicated topic and we have limited time. I think a flyby that we've been having here over the past couple meetings, it is that I want to test the assumption. I have no idea if it's right or wrong. I want to test the assumption that Ken just put forth for us to consider, that the treatment above this line in A and B above is the same premise as below the line. In other words, what are I want to hear from other people. Ken has made his point clear, and I think Mark is going to support that point based on prior conversation. I want to hear what the other teams' versions of, are they based on the same treatment? Because I do believe a fundamental principle is what's good for the goose is good for the gander. So if both these scenarios are based on the same premise, then let's nail that. But if there's disagreement about that, let's hear that. And that will help me drive the facilitation of this next conversation. So, you know, whoever else on the call that has a different point of view, that they are in fact categorically different, let's hear that point before we leap on to the next.
Looks like Chuck. And then Mark.
I just think when we start talking baseline, it's not well defined what the baseline is in the landfill. And I guess what I'm trying to say, some of this is redundant with the stuff up above. I think it should be as a reader, you start looking at all the redundancy and you get a little confused. It's supposed to go here or there. So what I'm saying is a lot of these topics are discussed up above. And it would be best to make an aggregate right there. So when you first come down, you know what the topic is instead of getting down below, and then it starts talking about the same thing and you're going, wasn't this defined? So you're just scrolling up and down trying to assimilate everything, where we should have it flow a little bit better without redundancy.
But just start with my fundamental, let me reframe my fundamental question. Is the baseline chart that Ken is using the same as the baseline chart up above? Are they the same or different, Ken?
Well, that is indeed an interesting question. So, I mean, I would not call the baseline a scenario, because scenarios, as they're kind of commonly understood, are indeed situations that exist in the real world, where this is, as I understand it, this is not a situation that actually exists in the real world. It's an extrapolation, a very simple extrapolation from a couple of data points, and I think, and it's never actually been stated it kind of exactly what the assumptions are underlying this, the baseline. But I think that if you were to drill down to them, you know, they make the same assumptions. Well, the factors that we know actually are going to, the actors that are going to be present in the real world going forward, especially over the next 20 years, there is indeed an assumption in the baseline, and it's assumption that's made for convenience, and that assumption is all of those factors are zero. So reductions, you know, intentions to reduce the waste stream, those will not matter. You know, assumptions to essentially address climate change, those will not matter. All of those things do not matter. So they're scored at zero for this particular baseline. And of course, you know, that's quite acceptable if you're indeed establishing a baseline. You're deliberately excluding them so that you can have a baseline, so that you can now reintroduce real world elements and look at it. So, you know, if we can agree on that the baseline is indeed different than real world scenarios, then you can establish the baseline, and then you can have scenarios that discuss essentially reflections on the baseline. So that, but I'm sorry, but calling it a scenario like this is actually going to happen in reality, you know, there's been no presentation of any sort of data that would indicate that essentially is true. So
let me just try to get more simplistic with this. I literally want to know if the figure 3.2 is the first time that appears is here, or in the sections above in A and B. Is it different than that? All I'm asking for is that whatever this section begins with, to the extent you are using one from above, and put whatever vernacular needs to be on it for clarity's sake, but we should start with the same at the same place, whatever that place is, and however you define it. Otherwise, the reader from this point on, if these two scenarios are not the same, or whatever they're called, baseline scenarios, agreed upon fiction, whatever, then it's going to get confusing. So just that very narrow question, are these the same or not?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I misunderstood the question. Yes, this is intended to be just a graphic representation of exactly what was stated up above.
Okay, good, thank you. So that creates a common understanding then for the flow going down. So let's get back then to the related question, which is, let's just cut to the chase, Ian or Ginger, what do you see as the differences between what happens after this point from what we basically are damn close to agreeing on above? What are the differences in treatment from your perspective?
So Sam, I'll be honest, I think we've made our position on this pretty clear in previous subcommittee meetings. We do modeling, based on what is considered the standard for the industry. And we have noted, below in the text that we are willing to acknowledge that there are things that could impact site of life and airspace, but it is not and has never been our intention to engage in futuristic or speculative scenario making. And, if we have to go through the rest of this report and have consensus in all other areas but this, then we can do that. But I just don't see that position of ours changing.
Okay. But I guess getting back to my fairness component, if what Ken has produced here in the however many figures there are, I don't have it printed out, so I can't read ahead, is really just a math problem. I mean, what I call the math problem is you make an assumption and then you say, if it turned out to be 20% up or down from the so-called baseline, then it becomes a math problem and it's depicted. Are these scenarios that Ken has put forward simply saying, here's an assumption, and if you assume 20%, 40%, or 60% up or down for this one factor, it looks like this, and then there's a figure. Is that what is going on here in these section C or 3, whatever the hell it is, drafts? Is that what it is?
And do you have thoughts? I mean, I know that we're still working on the quarry issue, for example.
Yeah,
The water table,
I guess my concern is that it's one person's assumptions on what these could or would be versus someone that is more familiar with that industry or that specific factor. For example, like an economist, if we're talking about impacts from a recession or various other experts. I mean, that's where I think I said it, one of the previous ones, I think that this is a good place to make a recommendation to that solid waste management plan, to have the experts that the county hires look into some of these to provide a little more detail, I guess, on them.
Okay. Then please, Dana, go up to that list that just has all the bullets. Okay, so let's say there are 25 bullets there on that list. My concern intellectually, and help me with this, it seems to me when we're looking at the future that there are probabilities that each of those items are going to happen or not over 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, and so on. Then there is a range of impacts, be they up or down. It seems like it is unlikely that the actual future is going to be only one or two of these 25 things. It's going to be a combination of these 25 things that really gives the reader the most likely if you just did a probabilistic analysis using the Monte Carlo, you're going to get a prediction as to what could happen. It's picking out only, and I apologize, Ken, I don't know how many scenarios you picked out. I'll call it 5 for reference. 5, and then making assumptions that if it's 20%, it looks like this. If it's 40%, it looks like that, without knowing why would one pick 20% or 40%. I get the consistency argument, but is it not misleading to say that it could be 20%? Well, of course it could be. It could be anything from 0 to 100. And without experts opining on the details, we don't know. So I'll stop there. Is it not true that the most probable future is some combination of these 25 factors discounted by probability of happening and range of impact when it does, right? Is that not likely the most likely scenario, a combination?
Are you asking me?
Yeah, I'm asking you.
Yeah, absolutely. That's absolutely what I think is the most likely scenario. And so
go ahead.
And we don't necessarily have expertise to figure out exactly what those are. But we do have to note them. Otherwise, I think we're just kind of abdicating our responsibility of coming up with a realistic estimate as to longevity, And the thing of it is we don't, just because we don't know these things in a number that you can actually stand behind, doesn't mean that you can't actually begin to put a shape to that. I think in some documentation, or some comments here, which I'm not sure have survived the transition either, I talk about the future as being essentially laying out the landscape that the landfill is going to go through. And so you can certainly map that out. You don't know exactly where that quicksand bog is, but there is one out there. And so you want to put that on the map. You don't know how likely it is that the landfill might go through, into the quicksand bog, but you want to have that map laid out. And that's something that you can communicate to people. People can make their own judgments, about how they feel like the issue of the climate crisis is going to play out in the future. But we do have to kind of note that there is such a thing as a climate crisis, and it does indeed affect the longevity of the landfill. If we don't do that, then, again, we're just, I don't know.
I agree with you on that, Ken.
Okay.
I agree with that. So here's where I think the linkage comes apart. Is I believe listing these things is fine. I like, if people can agree, the intuitive nature that, say, for each of these factors, it's likely to be increased longevity, decrease, or be neutral. Okay. It is when you transition to an actual chart that says, let's assume number 3 in this list of 25 is a number X, that it falls apart. That's where I think, while, from a thought experiment, I totally get it. Okay. But I think the most this group can do is say, here are all the possibilities. Educated people who are specialists give us probabilities of them happening and impacts of their happening, and come back to us and give us a more realistic view. That is fair and balanced. But just taking 2 or 3 of these things and saying these are the ones most likely to do it, and we're going to assume the impact is X% or Y%, that's where it just becomes a total thought experiment and doesn't ground decision makers who are going to have to make a decision in the next, 6 months on a CUP and 1.5 to 2 years on the SMMP. Just focus on that. why can you live with stopping at setting up the arguments? Meaning, this is like, to me, like the table of contents for the SMMP. Think about all these scenarios and tell us how much runway do we have on this landfill for purposes of sequencing all the other SMMP things we want to do. But stop there and not put the charts. Could you live with that?
I just wanted to briefly note we're just past
Yeah.
noon already. So just wanted to preface that. I'm happy to stay on for what we need, but just
Right, I got
let
it.
you know. Yeah.
The short answer is no. So
Okay.
we have an implied chart with what's in section A, with essentially the baseline. And so my contention is we already have essentially a misleading chart if you figure that's the way of terming it misleading. So I'm perfectly willing to depict the information in kind of whatever way. I'm also willing to have all of the qualifiers that the group deems necessary, but I'm not willing to let essentially the math equation, that Republic has put forward stand as kind of the only documentation of what the possible future of the landfill will be, for exactly the reason that you stated, Sam. That's just not likely to be the actual truth. How do we get at communicating what that actual truth is? Perfectly willing to have that conversation. These things have been sitting here for quite a while now. And this is kind of the first time that we've actually had a substantive discussion about them.
Thanks,
Let's
Ken.
go to Chuck. Let's go to Chuck, and then I'm going to make a suggestion going forward.
Well, like landfill expansion, it's fundamentally a three-prong approach: status quo, a hybrid of helping out a single utility here by putting some of the garbage here so they can keep ahead of their sequencing and send some out, or alternative, send it all out. I mean, that's just a simple three-pronged approach on landfill expansion, I guess.
All right, last call from Paul. You've been conspicuous by your silence during this issue, and since the light is shining on you from your window and you look somewhat angelic, I thought we would get divine intervention and have you opine, give us guidance and suggestions.
Well, I will do what I can, Sam. So I agree with Ken that the baseline projection needs to be framed in context, and the assumptions that underlie that should be clearly identified. I would pop the question back to you, Sam, and to some extent Daniel, which is, if all we do is list these as bullet points, the factors that might perturb the estimate, the baseline estimate, and our report basically gives a figure of the expected lifetime is 14.54 to 15.99 years. Here are a few other things that might impact it, but we're really not going to comment on those. Is that living up to the expectations of this group?
To be clear, I am absolutely open to more detail. And I swear I saw something from Ken that each of these bullets, and I'm making this up, had 2 or 3 sentences for each of these bullets. And maybe this is this missing document that didn't get carried over. I am absolutely open, more than open, to fleshing this out. It is the getting to, it's creating the sense that we know the answers to these things, that we do not have any possibility of knowing at this point, because we don't have the subject matter experts at the table, nor the time. So I think it's very important. More than we have here, but stop when you say it's going to be this number of years or not. You could say it could be this number of years, just like you could say above, it could be this scenario. But to the extent that there's so many factors here that are coming together, it attenuates the credibility of the conclusion more so because there's 25 factors that each have probabilities of happening and ranges of impacts. The up above, it's narrower. You are clearly saying here are 2 or 3 scenarios that are more grounded in what has happened. They're not perfect, but they're more grounded. That's the piece I'm trying to see if there's a way to come together to and get this information out there. But I'll stop. I'm just babbling. I apologize.
I have a perspective of, you know, I think we're at a stage of getting to sort of the end result of clarifying what the lifespan of the landfill is based upon various factors, right? I think that's the goal, is saying, you know, here's all these factors. How do they impact the landfill lifespan? I think as an overarching goal for this subcommittee, it would have been excellent if we could have enough information to have any sort of like confident numbers to contribute with regard to these. But I think we're at a stage in the development of that where we're essentially still researching. We're still trying to figure out how could these impact the lifespan of the landfill. And because we don't know that, when I'm pretty confident that we haven't even scratched the surface of the possibilities that all these factors and regarding all these factors and how they could impact the landfill, that it's sort of like being on a research assignment and just midway through going with your hypothesis because you're not quite done with your research assignment and somebody's asking for the results. I think it's just premature. What I think what we can say is that we don't know how these will impact the landfill lifespan, but as a group, we've discussed that these could very well impact the landfill lifespan. We just don't know how yet. And I think that calling that out is more fair for the reader than saying there's all these factors, you know, if we have a ton of assumptions, here's how one of these factors all by itself in a vacuum could impact the landfill lifespan. But based on our values, we could also interpret the same thing 100 different ways. I don't know. I feel like it's just a little bit or a lot of it premature and tough for the reader to understand, you know, what are we talking about here if we assign one factor all of these assumptions and not incorporate anything else.
Again.
Well, again, I just, you know, I'm going to keep pointing out, I guess, until the cows come home, that this is very asymmetrical. So we are kind of applying this standard about, well, we really don't know, to the scenarios essentially that I've put forward. But none of that gets applied essentially to, you know, the scenario that Republic has put forward. You know, that scenario is based upon, you know, what Republic says this is the limits of our model. This is the model that we use. That's what generates that particular number, and what works for Republic is not necessarily what this subcommittee is charged with doing. You know, it's fraught to essentially look at that and treat it in any way different than these other scenarios. So it's just as speculative. I mean, it assumes that 2.7 million cubic yards of rock vanishes in the next couple years or something. You know, I'm not even sure exactly what that is. So, you know, if we want to be symmetrical, and I understand that people would like to have more surety about future scenarios, you know, whether they would like to put a number to it, but the numbers that have been put to the Republic scenario are just made up numbers. You know, I can't stress this more. I mean, they don't really have a relationship to reality. That's how they can actually become a number. You know, but when people look at the future, they can look at factors and they can say, I mean, when futurists look at this sort of thing, they often do a simple 2x2 matrix. You identify two, I'm sorry, I'm going down a rabbit hole. We're already over time.
Right.
So anyway, I just think that we need to have a little bit of, I think that the best thing that we can do is to show that there are several different groups of outcomes that we have identified. I mean, this is a citizens, this is a community-led process, the work group I'm talking about. So essentially to say, well, these things we don't have experts, so we can't include them. I think you want to include as much as you can from a citizen's point of view. You know, I think it's a little, I'm not sure what I would call it, to essentially say, well, you're not expert enough to have those ideas.
That's not what I'm saying.
Okay, so I think that it would be good then to make sure that those ideas are included in this document.
Right.
And again, I'm happy to work with people as to how that's going to be done.
All right, so we do have to talk about one thing here. You know, we're not going to get concluded, nor did I expect to. Because I agree with Ken. This is the first substantive conversation on this topic, and I think the conversation will be benefited once Daniel has time to go back and backfill because I'm positive I saw a Ken document that had more detail on this than before, to see what that looks like. And I really want to look at, because I do agree that, you know, what's good for the goose is good for the gander, and that's copywritten, and I'm going to get T-shirts that say that, that it needs to be fair. But so we have to figure out what your subcommittee is going to talk about on Thursday. I'm strongly suggesting that we not tee up this conversation with them, because I am convinced you all have to do more work. If we're going to tee up this kind of conversation, which at its most base level is in or out of the report, I want that conversation to be at the end where we have gotten as close together as possible. And we are not there yet on this topic, because it would take, I mean, look how long we've been on this topic, a good 45 minutes. And we're familiar, you know, with the nuances of these 50 pages or whatever they are. So I want to defer that. I also need to think about, you know, do I ask the board for direction on this, and how do we tee that up fairly on this? And I want to understand more about, you know, what are the qualitative differences and subjective differences between the scenarios above and these. So I think we're going to have to, you know, leave the discussion for Thursday to the short version of this report, which are these key findings and key recommendations in their current state, and get input on those. So Paul, are you going to volunteer to be our spokesperson again for this august group of clear thinkers? Because, you know, you've got a track record, buddy.
Unless somebody else would like to carry the torch, I will do it.
And then Ginger, the co-spokesperson. Well, you're sick, so are you going to be able to attend virtually on Thursday?
My plan is to attend virtually. I did just find out I have COVID.
Oh, I'm sorry.
So it's unclear whether I would be on or Russ. I'm lobbying for myself. But I think it will just depend on how I'm doing between now and then, and whether Russ feels like that's a good use of my time. No disrespect to the group, just I think he wants me back in the office, you know, sooner rather than later, and he wants me to rest as much as possible. My plan, one of us will be on. My plan would be that even if I'm not there for the full subcommittee, I would be there for a portion of the report, given that he'd be kind of parachuting in on the subcommittee issue. I think I can make that commitment at least. Also wanted to suggest for our next meeting, and we can get or leave it and we can decide it works or doesn't work. If I can go to my folks at Republic and take that bulleted list of potential scenarios, the 25 or whatever that are on there, and get some consensus that we would be willing to go with each one and say, could increase, could decrease, group them together in some way, shape, or form that say, these are the factors that could, you know, should they arise, extend the life of the landfill. These are the factors that, you know, could decrease the life of the landfill. And these are the factors where we just don't have enough information. Would that be something that the subcommittee would be interested or willing to discuss at its next meeting as sort of a bridge to compromise or consensus point?
Well, I think the answer to that has to be yes. I mean, I can see several graphic ways to do this, and it is tier 1 in alphabetical order, all the factors that we agree are likely to increase. Tier 2 is could go either way, and tier 3 is decrease, and group them together alphabetically. And then you have this nice chart that gives the, you know, the overview. And then once I wouldn't do that, Ginger, until we get the next version, which is Daniel plugging and playing Ken's version into this, because there's more text surrounding each of these. And then that would be the perfect time, I think, to do that next step.
Okay, that's all I've got.
All right. Anything else for last call here, since obviously we're out of time? Thank you for staying an extra, whatever it's been, but we're getting down to the real meal deal here.
Yeah, my only last note is that I'm going to do my best to try to add the key findings, key recommendations from this document into the other document for the work group to kind of embed in their report. So just please track that. I apologize if it's not perfect this first time around. I doubt it will be, but yeah, please let me know if there's anything missing from that. You probably is most likely not going to get comments in from the rest of the group after this meeting for inclusion in this draft 1. So my request is just that you track it and add to it, comment on it, and we'll add it into subsequent drafts here, but I'm going to do my best to incorporate what we've talked about. So thanks for everyone's patience with that, and thanks for contributing. And I think I saw Paul's hand.
Oh,
yeah, a quick question, Sam and Ginger. What are we expected to present on Thursday? Is it simply this super preliminary summary of our key findings that we have right now? Is that what we're going to discuss?
I think that's all we have, all we're going to be able to do.
Okay. All right, thanks.
In other words, the body of the work group report, not your full subcommittee report. It's just not enough bandwidth to do the full subcommittee report.
And I think I have a little bit more direction today, so I'll try to add to it a bit before it makes it into the work group tonight. So there'll be an updated version is what I'm getting at.
All right, thanks everyone.
Thanks everyone.
Thank you.